Okay, so yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yuhao Zhang, under the supervision of Professor Patrick Linke with Matthias Stosiek as my advisor. And yeah, I'm at here at Aalto University, and my talk will be on experimental materials design using Bayesian optimization. So I'll first give some background and context, which motivates the purpose of my research, and then I will follow it up with a specific project which I just recently completed regarding the topic. So starting with the background. So, okay, the animations don't work here, but that's fine. But um, so although the Gartner hype cycle isn't very scientific, I think it's a good model to kind of visualize the different stages some result in a lab goes through before it faces the market. So starting at stage one, let's assume you synthesize some new material Y, and it has some really novel properties, and you get it published in a really nice journal. Now, certain materials then get this really large attention spike for whatever reason, and then it forms this bubble of high expectations. And many of the times, your material fails to meet these large hyped expectations, which essentially burst the bubble. So you then uh, result in this valley. And then the kind of attention of this material then falls back to obscurity within the scientific community. But however, scientists and engineers continue to develop, study, and optimize this material, which then actually, uh, with time, leads to market readiness, hopefully. So it's specifically now stages 1 and 4, which I'm more interested in, but most importantly, which my work also finds its use. So stages 1, which corresponds to the materials discovery part, and 4 of materials optimization part. Now, next, without preaching to the choir, I'll give some basic background or methods conventionally used to tackle stages 1 and 4. So you can have computational methods, as already discussed. So these can be simulation-based, based on physics such as density functional theory or molecular dynamics. However, with the results here, as we already saw, the results are only theoretical and needs to be validated through actual real-world experiments. And the second type of computational methods are then these machine learning types, which are now gaining more and more attention, such as the deep learning-based generative models. And main caveats with these approaches is that they usually require a large amount of training data. And this means that most of the time the training data is generated using some other computational methods such as DFT, meaning that these results, again, needs to be validated through experiments. Now, on the other side, what the experimentalists do is that they design their experiments using some, which are called DOE methods. So these can be predetermined sampling strategies, such as grid search. They have some compositional space, and they have a predetermined sampling strategy, which then they just synthesize the materials. Or they can be some more nuanced experience and intuition-based, or based on some physical insights, some previous publications. And this is more adaptive, but again, this is kind of then more heuristic and then prone to human bias. But we can do better, and that's where Bayesian optimization comes in. So sadly, the animation doesn't work, so the slides are a bit hidden, but it's defined as a sample-efficient adaptive strategy for optimizing black box objectives. And it consists of 2 parts, a a surrogate model, which as long as it produces a variance, it's the BO, Bayesian optimization, is surrogate model agnostic. So that could be a random forest, Bayesian neural network, or a Gaussian process, and an acquisition function, which is then the agent of then suggesting the next candidate function. So here is we'll briefly walk through the algorithm. It looks complicated, but it's actually really simple. So let's say you have some objective function here in the black, and then your model mean is prediction is this blue line, and then the green line is the next predicted point, with the red line being your sampled points. Now this should play like a nice animation of it going through the points, but this is the very end stage after you've sampled all these points, and then these shaded regions are the uncertainties of your model. So essentially, you start with some initial data set and you initiate your model. And then based on the model predictions, you have an acquisition function which you maximize over this X space. And then whichever x value which maximizes this acquisition function is your next point here, which is this dashed green line. And you evaluate that function, update your data set, feed it to the model, and then rinse and repeat until you've converged or you're happy with the results. Now, coming with the actual applications of where I've used this. So in the field of shape memory polymers. So these are polymers that exhibit reversible shape behavior. And there can be many mechanisms that trigger this, such as thermal, electric, magnetic, or mechanical ones. And they mostly find their applications in soft robotics or smart textiles. And within my project, our main focus relied on the thermally activated polymers with intended applications in smart textiles. So now going to the methodology of this project, so what we actually did. So starting with the first stage, so we called these thermally activated, twisted, and coiled polymer actuators. So this polymer is essentially made out of fishing line. So you can twist a large number of thin fishing lines together, and then you can coil them around the mandrel, and then you heat them in an oven to hold its shape. So in this case, you can produce these 8-ply coils, or you can take a single thick fishing strand line and just coil it, twist it on itself and coil it around the coil to create a 1-ply sample. Then after you have cured them in the oven, you can then knit them into this fabric, which upon heated, the coils expand, making the fabric expand. And when you cool it back to the original temperature, it'll contract again. And it'll just keep on cycling around this shape change with the change in temperature. And our question was to answer that what is the optimal ply number, the applied twisting stress during the twisting process, and the applied coil stress during the coiling process to produce the maximum actuation. So you want a large signal in these, is what it's usually called, for then actually useful applications. You want a large power output or a large strain. So just more on the experimental side, I collaborated with experimentalists who actually then synthesize and characterize the samples. Our variables are the number of plies, which go from 1 to 9, and for obvious reasons, these are discretized, so these do not take continuous values. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And for practical reasons, the twist and coiling stresses were also discretized to range from 1 to 10 megapascals at 11 equally spaced ranges, because it was non-practical to then have very decimal control over the weights that they used. So they began with preparing the fishing line coils with the set input conditions, and this involved twisting the coils lines in the Z direction at a fixed RPM and then coiling it in the S direction. And it's these twisting and coiling directions which control whether the coil in the end actually either contracts or expands. And we chose expansionary coils because there's a much larger bound for the maximum actuation, whereas if it contracts, the physical shape can then limit itself. Then the coils you can see are twisted and coiled in the first step around this mandrel, then it's fixed into shape. Then all you do is put it in the oven, and the temperature control is quite important because if temperature is too high, you actually start breaking down the polymer and will not exhibit this behavior, but it has to be high enough to undergo some thermal changes. So it has to be quite close to the glass rigid temperature. And then in the end, we use a thermal camera, and using an external heat source, you can heat the coil and you can record the actuation. And then we recorded 3 actuation cycles and took the average result just to remove any noise. And the most one important factor to note that is all our variables are discrete. And in the previous slide, I showed that BO example was in a continuous one. So we have to account for that. So we used a discrete GP using this kernel rounding method. And it's quite simple. All it does is that it rounds all of the continuous variables to the nearest integer. So your posterior landscape will be discretized naturally with the variance also discretized. So the acquisitions can only take these discrete values. So you enforce this discreteness into the model. So this meant that the ply number, applied twist, and coil stressors were all then encoded by these discretized integer values into the model. And our final model consisted of a product kernel of 3 discrete radial basis function kernels with gamma priors. And then we used this ELCB acquisition function as the acquisition strategy. So now kind of describing the workflow, because this is also an important part of our work. So again, with the input conditions splitting the pi count, twisting stress, and coiling stress, and then the target value that we get back is defined as the actuation strain, which is an engineering strain of the changing the length over the initial length. So this is what we want to maximize. So you begin with the synthesis and measurement, and this is what the experimentalists do. And then we have this digitalized AMAT notebook developed here at Aalto, where they can then use, which is an online database that's secure, which they upload their values. And then with the Python API, we are able then to process that data, and we have our in-house built Python package called Boss, which we then use to actually run the Bayesian optimization. And then it'll automatically then also upload the suggested inputs back into this online database, which the experimentalists can read and make the new samples based on the suggestions. And that concludes one iteration of BO. And then we keep this cycle going. And for context, around one iteration took around 1 week, depending if there's any bumps or hiccups along the way. So now on the results. So we have concluded the optimization, and during the data collection process, this is what we kind of get to see. So obviously the model is 3-dimensional. So here I plot slices along ply 1 just to be able to visualize 2-dimensional contour plots where the x-axis is the twist stress and y-axis is the coil stress, and the top figures is the model predictions, and the bottom one is the uncertainties with the predictions. And here you can see the discrete nature of the model as you see these kind of step-like features that the discretization is working as intended. And the blue triangles are the next sampling points that we want, and we use this Kriging-Believer method for generating more than one singular sample point because it would take quite a lot of iterations. It would be quite slow. So we had a batch size of 4. So at each iteration, we generate 4 candidate points for the experimentalists to synthesize. And as you can see, throughout the iterations, the uncertainty near the sampled regions also decreases as expected, as the model is more confident in those regions. And yeah, and then to kind of track the model behavior too. So here, this shows the iteration number, which we call batch, and these are the conditions at which the actuation is at maximum. But during batch 3, iteration 3, it became apparent that certain samples had a higher noise than other samples. So the noise is said to be more heteroscedastic than expected. So this meant that certain samples produced had a larger variance than others, and this misled the model via overfitting, so which was a problem. And that's why at batch 3, we decided to include repeats, so repeated of the previous data to have some model robustness. Also at batch 12, from the acquisition function, removed the fitted noise contribution to combat repeated sampling points. So the effect is seen here, where, as you can see, we use the model hyperparameters, which are hyperparameters of each kernel, which corresponding to each dimension. So one representing the ply, coil, and twist stress. So using these, you can kind of see the model behavior. And this overfitting process you can see here with iteration, I believe that's 10 or 11. And then with a huge drop in the hyperparameter values. But then because we repeated the sample points in the next iteration, you see that they recovered to the original values, which is a good thing. And the effect on the noise too, you can see that before including the repeats, the noise were at hyperparameters at really small values, which is unrealistic from our experiments. And when we included the repeats, you see that it actually raised to much more representative values. So this is a good thing. And so in the end, this is what our 3D prediction cuboid looks like. And this is the slice across ply 1, where the maximum actuation of the entire model is here. And it seems to show that the model seems to believe that the higher stress leads to higher actuation. So this edge here, which was interesting. And based on these predictions, our experimentalists conducted some more tests, some post-optimization tests. And here it's quite interesting. So you can see the cross-sectional geometries of the coil. It's a bit hard to see, but you can see that as the ply number increases from ply 2, the cross-sectional area approaches that of a circle. And this was interesting because we believe this is a factor because we observed that the actuation at these maximum conditions is maximum for ply 1 and lowest for ply 2, and it steadily increases to 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 9. And we believe the reason for that is due to this cross-sectional geometry reason, that the cross-sectional geometry closer to that of a circle produces higher actuation. That's why we see the trend of ply 1 having the highest actuation, followed by an increase from 2 to 9. So yeah, so in conclusion, we successfully optimized the actuation with these being the maximum conditions. And these values are very competitive with literature amongst other studies. Our model predicts high twist and coil stresses are required for high actuations across most plies. And then the cross-sectional geometry closer to that of a circle is observed to have larger actuation at these maximal stress conditions. Now, regarding point 1, this is other studies have actually been shown to this to be true. So this validates the model beliefs regarding this stress behavior. And it also aligns with prevailing theory from other studies too. So everything seems to be good. And yeah, in conclusion, we demonstrated the applicability of our modified BO workflow for both noisy and discrete data. And our results show that simultaneously high applied twisting and coiling stresses increase actuation, with more circular cross-sectional geometries likely producing higher actuation. And if you want to learn more, this project got recently published, so you can read to see more. And yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Yuhao. Are there questions?
Thanks a lot for the talk. It's actually quite rare to see like discrete variables in BO. I was wondering if the same acquisition functions work well for discrete as well as continuous, or did you find that maybe some changes are needed for most informative sampling?
Yes, so yeah, that is true. Most acquisition functions are only used on the continuous cases, so it's non-trivial to know how it will behave in the discrete cases. But in our case, we before conducting this, we benchmarked a few acquisition functions and found the ELCB to be the most stable. So we had some empirical results, but from a theoretical basis, it's not very clear which one should be the best acquisition function in these cases.
Thanks.
Yeah, Ram.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned that each cycle roughly was 1 week.
Yes.
So I guess most of it was on the experimental side.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's 4, right? Your batch size was 4. You
Yeah.
made 4 recommendations to make 4 new samples.
Yeah.
It's 1 week.
Yeah, 4. Yeah, so one iteration was a week, and each iteration we had 4 samples.
Yeah. Okay. Now, did you also try random, meaning without the Bayesian optimization as a baseline, right? To see how your boss approach outperformed the traditional.
Yes, so that is something that we didn't do like in parallel to this. It's something that like you can kind of maybe test in hindsight. So knowing this landscape here, and let's say assume that this is like true, you can then maybe do some like random sampling sequences, and like as long as you sample this point, then like you've gotten it right. So again, always in hindsight, you can say that, oh, if you did some like 5-point grid search of the corners and middle section along all plies, then you'd have got this naturally too. But again, that's always something you see in hindsight, and during the optimization process, we don't know. But yeah, that's a good idea that for my actual other benchmarks, I do compare with random sampling.
To add, the collaborators already produced 120 samples. They were not amused to produce more. So that's why That's why this random baseline is difficult to do when the experiments take a certain amount of time. If you have faster ones, of course, you can.
Now you have enough data points to create a model that your collaborators can use in production mode, right?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. So the
They must be
trends.
happy if, right?
Yeah, so the trends that they learned, they're happy with, right? So you can do a form of transfer learning. So let's say we used this commercial fishing line material, right? But we expect this behavior to be applied to other polymeric shape memory materials. So they can transfer so they would probably start that produce at high twist encoding stresses for other polymeric materials too. Yeah.
Okay, there was one question over there. Yes. Can you turn on the mic?
If I understood right, you're getting your highest actuation at the limits of your bounds.
Yes.
Do you think your window is large enough? Is this worth going back and exploring even beyond those bounds?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And yes, that's something I should have addressed. But this is actually quite a physical limit because when we tried to increase the twist encoding stresses, the risk of the line snapping was actually very high. So this is quite a physical limit where you can actually reliably keep producing at these conditions without snapping the lines.
Okay. Was there one more question? Yeah, please.
Very clear presentation, thanks. At some point you mentioned that there was a particular region in the design space where the variance of your estimates was increasing. Where was that region?
Should be decreasing, right? So here you can see as you sample these new data points, these pink circles, you see the variance being lowered around them. So the variance is decreasing as you add more and more data points.
Yeah, okay, and then I misunderstood you. I thought that you meant that even when you repeated the samples, that because of as you varied one of the design parameters, that inherently the behavior of the system was more.
Oh, so that's this resampling issue here.
Yeah.
Yes. So as an example, let's say we have this data point here. You see it's very smooth here, but let's say you sample this point here, and let's say this point is a very, very large or very small value. Then it creates this large spike and causes overfitting. And that data point was actually an anomaly, So that noise in the data point is something that we had to account for with the repeats because the model otherwise assumes almost perfect data and it didn't account for the anomalies.
I understand.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so I see no further questions, so let's thank Yuhao again. And we are perfectly in time for the coffee break. So the coffee break is served just outside. And we have, I think, 40 minutes for it, right? So you can take your time. If I could ask the speakers for the next session to come up and set up during the coffee break so that we're then ready to go for the next session, please.